A really warm welcome to this evening's lecture by Dr. Chelsea Slater from the University of Wolverhampton's Institute of Human Sciences, which is part of the Faculty of Education, Health and Wellbeing. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us tonight for Chelsea's lecture. My name is Paula Harrison, for those who don't know me, and I'm the coordinator at University Centre Telford. We're part of the University of Wolverhampton, and we are a regional learning centre based in the heart of Telford in Shropshire. Before the pandemic, we delivered our public lecture programme in our centre, and Chelsea delivered two very successful and popular lectures in the centre in 2019, which seems like a lifetime ago now. We then moved our public lectures online during the pandemic, and Chelsea delivered an online lecture from her parents' home in the States in December 2020. We're hoping to deliver some of our lectures back in the centre in the coming months. But don't worry if you can't attend, because I know there's people from all around the world joining us tonight. All our lectures are recorded, and the recordings are available on the University Centre Telford YouTube channel and on Panopto. So just before I hand over to Chelsea, I just wanted to explain that there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end via the Q&A button. And if you're using a laptop or a desktop, the icon is on the bottom of your screen in the middle. And if you're using your mobile, it will be in the top right-hand corner. So as I said, we're delighted to welcome Chelsea for her lecture tonight on Introduction to Forensic Psychology. Chelsea is Director of Postgraduate Programmes in Psychology at the University, course leader for Forensic and Investigative Psychology, and a senior lecturer in psychology. So welcome, Chelsea, and thank you so much for taking the time to deliver this lecture for us.
Thank you so much for having me back, Paula. It's always great to work with the Telford office, and for those of you who haven't checked it out, the Telford office offers not only lectures, but also small courses. I can recommend those because I'm currently taking BSL over there as well. So highly recommend that. I'm going to go ahead and start screen sharing, and we're going to just jump into this. If you do have questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A, but we'll read them at the end then, because I'm very easy to get sidetracked with those, but happy to answer everybody's questions at the end then. So let's hope that this works. All right. Hopefully everybody's seeing the slides.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, good. I'm just so used to the silence of my students. I just don't expect any answer back. So tonight we're just going to do a brief overview of an introduction to forensic psychology. I cannot cover everything. It is a massive area. I think most people underestimate how big forensic psychology is and how big it can be. So tonight, my goal is just to give you a brief overview of what forensic psychology actually is and all the aspects that go along with that. A little bit of a history of some of the most famous people that I think of in forensic psychology. I'll point out that that depends on who you're talking to. A little bit more of a concrete example of some of our research and why it's important that we continue to do research. And then I'll end with a little bit more about what a chartered forensic psychologist does, the fact that I'm not one. But if you were interested in forensic psychology, what are some options for you here in the UK? I can talk a little bit about some other places in the world, but I know this is quite an international audience attending, but unfortunately I am based in the UK. I understand the UK system. But a lot of the systems will be quite similar then as well. So one of the places I always like to start are some misconceptions. So obviously, if you guys are attending, you have some sort of interest in forensic psychology, even if it is, I just want to know what this actually is, to I have a favorite TV show, how similar is this to real life? But we get a lot of misconceptions. We get students coming in at the undergrad, postgrad, across all levels pretty much, coming in with these misconceptions as well. I was surprised at how many students come to join a psychology degree, but think that isn't it just forensic science? What's the difference between the forensic science and forensic psychology? I want to be just like the people in CSI or, the lab workers in Dexter. Isn't that just what you do? Other people who might know a little bit more about forensic psychology think, well, isn't it all just profiling, a little bit like Criminal Minds and solving mysteries. Isn't that what you do? And then for the people who know a bit more about psychology in general and psychology overall, I hear this said to my face that I want to go into forensic psychology because they don't do any statistics there. They don't do any math there. But I hate to tell you, all of those things are wrong, and that is definitely not the case. So in reality then, forensic psychology is not forensic science. Forensic science is more about physical evidence, versus forensic psychology looks a lot more about people's behaviors and patterns of behaviors and why they are the way that they are. But we'll get what the forensic term means, because I think that's what confuses people. It's a very, very broad area of research, and there's pretty much no area of psychology that forensic psychology doesn't overlap with and can think of a forensic application of their research. I've been trying for years, asking my students to help me, and I've not been able to find an area of psychology yet that we haven't been able to find some application for. So we're very, very big. And we're not usually the investigators. If you do go further in forensic psychology and find your way working with investigators, you might work with them, you might consult with them, you might be somebody that they come with. But unless you go into the police, you're not going to be the person solving the crimes, going out and arresting people. So I think that's the trouble with a lot of the TV shows, is they combine a lot of different roles all together to make it more interesting for us to watch at home. But realistically, that's not the same thing. And as for statistics, if this is an area you're interested in, we do have lots of statistics, but there's different ways of doing it. There's more word-based ones, there's more number-based ones. And if you're really interested and if you develop the research, it's not nearly as scary. And trust me, if you get a good lecturer or those people can help you through that. I didn't think I liked the statistics that much, but actually this is my favorite thing now. It's one of my favorite things to teach. And I've had to do some very advanced ones in forensic psychology. So I always laugh when people tell me that they want to join forensic psychology because they won't do statistics then. So one of the best places I think to start is, what is forensic psychology? And this is actually how I start a lot of my lectures, is asking about how would you define the topic that we're talking about? So with forensic psychology, what actually is it? I think people have a general idea, but to put it into words can sometimes be very difficult. And what we find is that actually it's also very difficult for specialists to define as well. A lot of it depends on what backgrounds we have coming into it, what our personal interests are. And everybody has different philosophies and approaches that also can influence the definition. So we actually recognize that it is quite difficult to define. But what we can say is that forensic just actually means of or used in the court of law. So it has to do with about the court system. So this is why you have forensic science is looking at the physical evidence for the most part, and we're looking at anything that might then have an impact on a court case. One definition that I quite like is forensic psychology is reflected by any application of psychological knowledge or methods to the task facing the legal system. And I think this is quite a good definition that's really bitty. I tend to approach a very broad sense of forensic psychology in that it's anything to do with crimes and the legal system and psychology and how people and behaviors and all of that come together. That doesn't sound as professional on a piece of paper, but I take a very, very broad approach to forensic psychology, but I know a lot of my colleagues might not then. So it is quite difficult to define. To help a little bit with visualizing this a little bit more, another definition you could use is the applications of psychological knowledge and methods to the study of crime and criminal behavior. Again, that's much more similar to how I approach things. And so this could be things like the psychological aspects of the legal processes. So, you know, how is information presented in the court? How do juries make decisions? How do offenders understand judges' sentencing? Those sorts of things that are happening. You can look at the processes beyond the court, so about the investigations, about the rehabilitation afterwards. So the court's just the midpoint stopping with this, but we have everything basically from, you know, before birth all the way up through somebody's death. So, you know, what genetic factors, what background and stuff prepossesses people to be likely to commit crimes, what then develops during their lifetime, what causes things to go wrong for them to become a criminal. And then once we catch them for this crime, how do we get them to stop doing this? How do we deal with the consequences of them having committed crimes. And this is where psychology can work in with this. So that is a lot of times is, who becomes offenders? Why do people commit offenses? But we also look at things like, how do people investigate things? What are the impact of people investigating? How do we get that information across to the juries? But also as well as victims, why are people victims? Why are they likely to be victims? How do they respond after the event? How can we help them recover? As well as secondary victims, because sometimes it's not just them, it's their friends, their families, the people around them will also feel the impact of crime, and psychology can step in with this as well. So some real world applications, again, to help with this. I mentioned already about jury decisions. Again, most of us in our home countries, or a lot of us, depending on what countries, but my background in the United States and in the UK, we have juries. And in order to be able to vote, you have to register for the jury duty. And so we might be called to make these decisions. So how do everyday people make decisions in these big cases? Who do they listen to? When they disagree with each other, how do they make those decisions? So psychology can help with that, and forensic psychology specifically. You can think about things like politics in the media. So many politicians, when they're running, want to be hard on crime and do things about that. But what does that actually mean? We also look at things like fear of crime. A lot of people who watch a lot of crime shows actually have a higher fear of crime and think crime is going up, but actually statistically, a lot of crimes are going down. And some of the ones that are increasing, either they didn't exist before or social changes are happening and we're more likely to believe and people are reporting more often. So this can work with statistics and crime numbers. We also look at famous and infamous cases and look back and think about what psychology led to those points, what psychology led to the investigations. Unsolved ones, we might make guesses at who we think was likely to be the offender or not. Some of this is also where profiling can get in. I'm not going to talk too much about that in this lecture. I do have another lecture on profiling that I can always deliver. So if that's something you guys are interested in, let Paula and the Telford office know, and I'm always happy to give another one of my lectures. We might even think about in forensic psychology, things like crimes against vulnerable populations and warning signs, groups of people that can't give voice to themselves, elderly, people with mental cognitive delays or disabilities, children, people who might not understand what's happening to them. How can we see what's happening and intervene? I think what a lot of people wonder, and I think what draws a lot of people to forensic psychology, is why does crime happen? What causes somebody to go do these horrific things? And what can we do to prevent crime? And we don't have an answer, but we have ideas and research into this. And the last area we might also think about are things like, how do we prevent recidivism, which is our fancy word to say they go on and commit more crimes or the same types of crimes. So how do we get them to stop committing more crimes? Now, I mentioned already that forensic psychology is a big umbrella. We can use all the other branches of psychology. So oftentimes new psychology students can get a bit frustrated because we often don't let them do forensic psychology stuff until further into their academic careers. And they're like, but I signed up for forensic psychology. That's the only thing I want to pay attention to. But actually, we need them to understand other branches of psychology first, because we need to then understand how it goes in normal populations and normal situations, and then apply those theories and ideas in a forensic setting. And actually, when we get to that, then it makes a lot more sense to people. But within forensic psychology, we have the more applied side of things and the more theoretical. And then I've split up some of these branches based upon this. So the applied is more, the research means we can implement it right away and start helping processes right then. The theoretical is more about the theories behind it, the ideas behind it. It's good to know and it helps inform a lot of the applied side of things, but it might not have a direct application right away. So on that side of things, we've got things like biological psychology. So, the synapses, enzymes, and those sorts of things, how do they influence somebody's behaviors? Developmental psychology, how do certain milestones, at what point does somebody become a criminal, and can you do anything to stop it? So it's about how you get older. Cognitive psychology is, again, how your brain functions, the synapses and those sorts of things, what sort of delusions might be happening. Is somebody delusional when they commit crimes or not? And social psychology, this is a little bit more of my background, but this is how people interact with each other and the world around them, and what that has an influence on them. So if you're hanging out with a group of people that are also committing crimes, are you more likely to commit crimes. On the more applied side, we have things like police psychology about who becomes a police officer, how they interact with people. I think this is an area that there's going to be a lot of scrutiny over the last couple of years and continuing forward. Clinical psychology, this is probably the branch of psychology most people know. This is about diagnosing and treating illnesses and mental illness and moving forward. And of course, there's going to be a forensic application of that. Prison psychology, how do people exist in prison? How do people exist not being able to control what time they wake up, what time they do anything, not being able to go do stuff when they want to? What does that do to somebody? And how do they, deal with hierarchy and danger and stuff like that? My personal favorite, which is my jam, is investigative psychology. And this is everything we can do from basically the commission of the crime up until the court case, about how do we help the investigation? How do we help catch the bad guy that did this? What can psychology do with this? And there's so many different areas with that. And that's my main focus. That's what my PhD was in investigative psychology branch. And that is what the master's program that I run focuses on as well. We have a big chunk about that as well. So these are just some more ideas of some of the other areas that we're connected to. I've already covered about social and sociology. Neuro and cognitive, again, are the biological and chemicals. And, traumatic brain injuries can have a big impact on impulse control. There's other imbalances that can cause people to be more likely. Genetically, there's been some conditions that we wondered if made people more likely to commit crimes or not. Some of those have not worked out and others have. Developmental is about how people progress and how they age throughout their life. And the clinical is about the treatments and can we get somebody to stop and how can we help people? But this will also be the side that looks at, victims and how can we help them through the trauma? How do you help somebody who's been through something horrific, who's going through PTSD? What support can help them with that as well? So all of this can be forensic as well. Now, one of my other personal favorite areas is a newer one, and this is cybercrime. And this is really looking about how forensic psychology in a cyber world. So we have, crimes have existed since man has existed, but we now have this new space, but we don't have laws and we don't really understand how people interact there and how it's different from face to face. So there's this idea that oftentimes as we get new technology, there's an arms race with criminals, and oftentimes they're there first. And we've seen this with lots of different other types of technology. And so we're seeing the same thing with the internet. So a good example of this is actually bootleggers from Prohibition time in the United States. For those of you who like fast cars or souped up muscle cars, or even slightly higher proof alcohols, we can thank all of those from the bootleggers during Prohibition, who were the first to get a hold of cars and crank up the engines so they could outrun the police that were after them while they were trying to run it from, Canada into the United States when alcohol was illegal. And then the police had to try to figure out how to do the same thing and catch up to them. But what we see is the rise of people's time online. Most of us have in our pockets the internet with our phones, with our computers. And we could see that even before the pandemic, that young adults were spending quite a lot of time online. And I think basically all the preliminary studies I'm seeing from COVID times is that we spent even more time when we couldn't go out in person, we'd spend more time online. So this is a really important area for us to understand. So with this, we have a couple different ways that crime is happening online. So we have the cyber element of things, where traditional crimes now have a cyber component of it. So people, contacting drug dealers online, people listing, looking for, hitmen or something online. Those have existed before, but they now have an online application. There's crimes that didn't exist before the internet that can only exist now, things like hacking and trolling and doxing, where the internet, without that, you can't have that. And then there's some thoughts about these completely virtual crimes about, if somebody's World of Warcraft character gets stolen or lose their levels and those sorts of things, is that a crime or not? And there's different thoughts about this in the Western world versus some of the Asian countries that a lot more people spend more time in some of those virtual spaces. But one of the fascinating things with this is just how little we know, and we're getting to know a lot of that, but also the laws are lagging behind. But part of the reason I'm super excited about this is because the University of Wolverhampton has a lot of the leaders of cyber psychology there, and they have the cyber psychology research, the University of Wolverhampton, or our CREW research network, and I'm a part of that. There's a lot of forensic people from the university that are involved in that as well, because that I think is a very growing area of forensic psychology as well, is about these crimes happening online. So hopefully this gives you an idea of kind of the how many different areas forensic psychology can touch and all these other branches of psychology. Now, I think it's useful to see kind of where we came from. And, you know, there's been some missteps along the way, a lot of them actually, and we'll cover a couple of them now. But how did we get to the point that we are now, where we know certain theories, certain ideas, certain applications? Now, history of looking back at these things is always interesting because it depends on people's backgrounds, the countries that they're from, the papers that they have access to, and their background as well. So these are just my choices for the important things with this. So looking at kind of forensic psychology and mental illness and the law in the United Kingdom, there's a long history of this. So we know that the earliest recorded legal principle about mentally ill was actually from Marcus Aurelius in 179 AD. Now, some of the terms that will be coming up in this part are not particularly nice terms, and hopefully most of us recognize that we've moved past these terms, but legally these were the terms that were being used. So in England and Wales, there was actually a legal category classifying the mentally disordered, and it first appeared in 1324 as the Statutes at Large. And this distinguished between your lunatics and your idiots. And in both cases, it wasn't really about what they were suffering, what they were going through, were they responsible. It just meant who got their stuff when something happened, or can you take their stuff from them? So it was more about property rather than about the people with any sort of mental illness. We have the first acquittal in England on the basis of insanity in 1505, but it wasn't until the 18th century that courts really began to develop any sort of criteria to assess if somebody really was legally insane. And again, are they responsible? What's happening afterwards? Are they capable of committing that crime? And so it became a much bigger issue going into the 19th century, and became parts of these legal tests then about, is somebody fit to stand trial or not? And so one of the biggest cases we have to pay attention to is the case of Daniel Macnaghten in 1843. So Daniel was actually a Scottish woodturner who went on to assassinate an English civil servant, Edward Drummond, while he was suffering from what we think were paranoid delusions. So he really at the time thought he was, going after the prime minister and that things were going on. So this gave us this idea of mens rea, or the conscious agency, so that just because somebody commits this crime, they need to understand that it's wrong. And at that point in time, due to his mental illness at that time, he wouldn't have been able to understand that. He thought he was doing something good and something right. So this gives us rise of Macnaghten's rule that went into place. And it's a rule for determining whether somebody was criminally insane or not, and the consequences of the disease of mind. So these are some of the earliest indications. We've developed it a little bit more since then, but we're not going to go too much further into this then. Now, somebody who looked more at the biological roots of crime is somebody called Lombroso. So he was in the late 19th century. So he took groups of hardened criminals and carried out what might be called anthropological studies of their features. And he compared the criminal features with those of soldiers he practiced medicine on, because that's who he had access to. And so according to Lombroso, you actually have physical criminal characteristics that differentiates criminals from normal, everyday, law-abiding citizens. And so these things can be things like lack of skull space for their brain tissue. They might have pronounced structural differences between the two sides of their skull, ears that stick out, bent or flat noses, color blindness, left-handedness, and lack of general muscular strength. He even could say that he could differentiate between different types of criminals, and said that murderers had eyes that were bloodshot, where cold and glassy as well, whereas sex offenders had more of a glint to their eyes. Now, his interesting idea with this as well was that it wasn't that women were more advanced and that's why fewer women commit crimes, but actually women are so further behind in development that they're not, evolved enough to be committing crimes. So hopefully this is starting to sound really off to you guys, because the reason we remember Lombroso in psychology is because he's wrong. You can't tell somebody's a criminal just by their features, by, the skull shape, the fact that, that they're got different glints in their eyes and stuff like this. This is a branch that, yes, he thought he was doing science in it. At the time, he thought it was cutting edge technology, but it's really a defunct group. We don't recognize this, but we have to, acknowledge it in some of our history because there's still some people who believe that you can look at somebody and know if they're a criminal. How many times do you hear about, a horrific case has happened and people are like, I never would have guessed it. He doesn't look like the type. Well, what is a type? And a lot of the features that we associate with them are things that people add to themselves to identify as part of some of those groups. So getting back on track with the more useful areas of forensic psychology, we moved to Hugo Munstenberger, a man ahead of his time. So in 1906, he was asked by a defense attorney to review a case of a mentally disabled client. So in this, a woman had been found dead in Chicago. She'd been garroted by a copper wire and left in a barnyard. The term at the time was that the simple-minded farmer's son, so probably somebody of quite low or mentally developmentally behind farmer's son who discovered her body. He was being accused of this. He had an alibi, but when he was being questioned by the police, he admitted to the murder. And he didn't just confess. Every time he spoke, he was willing to repeat it again and again and add more details. He was getting a lot of attention for that. So it became clear for those who know more about mental illness and low intelligence that he was enjoying the attention, but he didn't understand what was happening. And he had an alibi. He couldn't have done this. And so Munstenberger kept pushing that this man was clearly not the one involved, that it's absurd and contradictory. He actually even compared it to the Salem witch trials, where similarly vulnerable people were convicted and coerced to self-incriminate. And so he even ended up sharing a letter with a nerve specialist in Chicago, and that ended up going to the newspaper. Unfortunately, him pushing forward for all of this made the judge furious. This idea that, psychology and science could help with these sorts of things like eyewitness and confessions was just absurd. Like, everybody just understands how this goes. We don't need any experts. And this farmer's son ended up getting hanged for the crime that clearly he didn't commit and was clearly a miscarriage of justice. So because of this, then, Hugo Munstenberger went on to write on the witness stand, and this basically called upon lawyers to appreciate the relevance of experimental psychology on their profession, and especially looking at the performance of improving witness recall. And for us, this is really what we believe now. This is really what we focus on. This is, quite modern. Unfortunately, like I said, he was a man ahead of his time, and he was actually just laughed out and was just not given the credence that it should have been. So we could have made so many more strides if we started researching much earlier, but unfortunately, people just didn't listen to him. Another one that this is somebody that people tend to know a little bit more if they know anybody is William Marston. So he, in 1922, became the first professor of legal psychology, which is quite closely related with forensic psychology. But a lot of people know him because of the prototype polygraph that he came up with. And this basically looks at systolic blood pressure as an indicator of deception. Now, realistically, polygraphs are not admissible in courts because they're not particularly accurate. What they measure is stress. Some of them are systolic blood pressure, some of them are galvanic skin responses, heart rates, those sorts of things. But really, it has to do with stress. They're super easy to beat. Honestly, there's some videos of news reporters within 15 minutes of being coached how to beat them. And if you think about it, if you're being interviewed by the police, something's gone wrong. Either, somebody close to you has had something happen, you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, or you actually committed that crime. Either way, it's probably likely to be very, very stressful. So there's a reason that these aren't allowed into the courts. But that is part of his legacy, is that these people know that he is part of the reason that we recognize this. He then actually was a psychological consultant for the U.S. Justice Department. Useful for me is he was also part of a court trial in 1923 of Fry versus the United States. And I actually still was able, this is still in practice and still in precedent in the United States. And I actually have to used it and quoted it for part of my PhD. And it's all about how new scientific evidence is introduced to the courts and what sort of precedents and steps need to be taken before new science can legally be introduced in court cases. And this is one of a trio of cases and laws currently that in the United States allow evidence into the courts. And because it's similar in the United Kingdom, they see what happens in the United States and oftentimes copy. So this is really helpful that this is the first of the 3 cases that we talk about with that. And the third, or the final reason that a lot of people might know William Marston is he's also the creator of Wonder Woman. So a man of varied talents and stuff. There is some more recent movie about him. I haven't seen it, so I can't say how accurate it is, but somebody worth looking into because he's got a lot of interesting backstory to him then. Now, I couldn't do a psychology lecture if I didn't mention Freud. This is another one of those branches that we don't pay that much attention to except for historically. We have psychoanalysis from the late 19th to early 20th century. This idea that, slips of the tongue, certain, hangups that we have would come out in dreams and stuff like that. So we mostly don't pay attention to that and how that would explain criminals anymore. But it's the background that we have for a lot of this. But coming from this sort of background, we have the term kleptomania that still kind of is around. This is the stealing insanity, people who just can't help themselves. And it's also some of the first to really start talking about some of those sexual motivations for some crimes, which we do know actually has a big impact on some things. And again, with my area of research, looking at sexual motivation and stuff is very helpful, but not an area I'm going to spend a whole lot of time in our brief overview tonight. So getting into the more useful and more up-to-date, this will lead into a lot of the biggest areas of forensic psychology, is looking at memory and forensic psychology. I think this is probably the area that has had the most done and the most impact on the current criminal justice and investigative systems. So we can look back that memory research really, some of the earliest useful stuff that we started to see comes from Ebbinghaus in 1885, who did some pioneering work on memory. And then that information was then being able to be applied to eyewitness testimony. And that it actually showed that you could test this and you could experiment and you could start to look into these processes to understand what's happening so we could try to do them better. But a lot more of the progress that we understand comes from the Wundt laboratory in 1875, and specifically looking at Binet in 1900. And he was able to look at how people can be quite suggestible through interrogations, through interviews, and how easy it is. So he actually ended up writing a lot of this in his book, and I'm going to slaughter this because it's in French, La Suggestibilité, that was published in the 1900s. And in this was a series of studies that he actually did where he manipulated and measured the interrogative suggestibility of French school children. So what he would do is through both oral and written questions, be able to shift what they remembered. And so some of this was by showing them pictures of stamps on envelopes. And then in the questions asking about, if you're going to describe or draw the stamp, asking questions about it being covered by a stamp from the postmaster and stuff like that. There actually hadn't been, but the amount of the students and children that he was able to convince that it was there shows how easy it is for suggestibility to happen. And just, a small word in a question can really shift how people remember this. And this is really the start of that. And then we went on, and there's been a lot more recent stuff looking at this. Now, we see the boom years of really from the 1960s to present, where forensic psychology has really increased, and psychology and research in general has increased. The quality has increased. Ethically, we've increased. There are some crazy stories about what was allowed in psychology studies in the way back when. That's a topic for another time. But we see a lot of the areas of applied forensic psychology start to come out of these times. And these are things that we still use to this day. So we see things with like criminal personalities. So Eisnick's Penn model, which is your psychoticism, extroversion, and neuroticism, is still a scale that's being used. Robert Hare was one of the early people to mention about psychopaths, and the psychopathy checklist, revised now, is still in use. Now, again, if you see that online where you can fill it out to see if you're a psychopath, one of the main traits of being a psychopath is lying. So it is not meant to be filled out by yourself. It's meant for somebody who's been working with you and stuff to fill it out about you. So if you do have fun with those, that's really what it is, for fun. We see things like group dynamics and jury decision making from Penrod. But probably the biggest area, and relating back to that eyewitness memory with the Wundt Laboratory and Binet, comes in the 1970s with Elizabeth Loftus. So this is one of the first times we really get a female coming in. Psychology really from that point forward has started to be a lot more female focused, a lot more women being involved, and forensic psychology definitely is that case nowadays. But a lot of the big theories are still older, usually European or American white men, but we are moving past that. But Loftus is quite famous for groundbreaking research that she did on misinformation effects and eyewitness memory, and about how easy it is to create these false memories. Specifically looking at, she got brought forward in criminal cases looking at recovered memories from childhood sexual trauma. And in 1975 set a legal precedent when she provided Washington State's first expert testimony about eyewitness memory, looking specifically at the topic of eyewitness identification. But she's most known in psychology for just the changing of a word. So she showed students and participants a video of a car crash, and realistically it's not very fast, it's more of a bump, but the difference of when you ask them to describe when the car bumped into each other versus the car smashed into each other, the memories really shift in just those small word changes. As soon as she said smashed, people remember things like broken glass, broken taillights, which definitely wasn't the case. So just one small word can really shift how somebody remembers things. And this really gives us some of this basis that we now have in our understanding of eyewitness testimony then. So that's just a brief snapshot into some of the big areas of forensic psychology, but it is a fast growing field because anytime there's new advances in any area of psychology, we are able to take it on in forensic psychology. So as more is understood in other areas, we advance at the same time. And honestly, how much has changed the last 10, 15 years that I've been involved, I can't imagine what it's going to be like in another 10 to 15 years. We have so much information and things that we understand better. We can have more technology that gives us access to, brain patterns, genetics, and those sorts of things. So we're building our understanding slowly, and it's improving every day. So this is definitely an area to keep an eye on. Bringing you guys back to the applied versus the academic or theoretical side, here's these same areas with some of the areas of research that we currently have going on in those areas. So in the more applied side, things with police psychology, we have stuff like recruitment, stress levels in police officers, how do police officers and investigators deal with really harmful images and stuff like that. There's a paper actually I look at with my master's students about investigators who have to deal with looking at child pornography as investigations and stuff like that. What does that do to their mental health? Clinical psychology is things like assessments and predictions of, how risky is it to release this person back into the public? How likely is it that they're going to reoffend? Prison psychology, how do you treat people while they're in prison, the dynamics, parole and release, what sort of things do we need to understand about that? Investigative psychology, like I said, that's my area. You have things like profiling, geographical profiling, eyewitness testimony, detecting deception, all of that can really fit under that investigative side of things. Even things like forensic linguistics can fit in there. Now, on the more academic and theoretical side, we have biological psychology, which has things like inheritance of criminality. So do people actually inherit some sort of criminal gene from parents and stuff? Or is there other things happening with that? What about the effects of injury? So traumatic brain injuries, we do know that that can have an impact. Developmental psychology, looking at, as people progress through their lives, if they're aggressive as a child, it doesn't mean that they're going to be an aggressive criminal adult or not. What about delinquency? Do people grow out of it? Do they not grow out of it? Cognitive psychology is also where eyewitness testimony can fit in if you're looking at the more memory side of things. What processes happen to influence people's memories? And we'll actually talk about eyewitness testimony a little bit later in this lecture as well. Interviewing, we've already talked about how easy it is to shift people's memories. with them just by small words. So what happens in a police interrogation? And do they know this, or is it an unconscious thing? Social psychology is looking at things like jury studies, jury influences. How do we look at that? Media influences. So if the media is telling us that crime is on the rise, what do we actually feel about if that's actually the case or not? So there's so much that we look at in forensic psychology. So hopefully this gives you a big overview of what we're doing. So I'm somebody who likes to have practical hands-on stuff to help people remember and understand things a little bit better. So we're going to go into a more specific example of forensic psychology, because a lot of this hasn't gone into detail. It's just been a little bit all over the place. So I've talked already about how important eyewitness testimony is, and how much forensic psychology and psychology in general has had an impact on this. But we do think this is the area that psychology has probably had the biggest impact on, changing how things are done in investigations, in the legal process, in people's understanding of this. We do know that eyewitness evidence can play a very important role in an investigation. From the very first stages of when, somebody gets called to a crime scene, the first thing police are going to ask is, what happened here? They're going to be asking the people, what did you see? What did you hear? That can lead them to where they go for the investigation, what leads they start to follow up. Then you get, the witnesses who might have seen the crime, who would be trying to remember things to identify people. This can help you find your suspects and stuff. And then it will also play a role in the court case, because that will again be brought into the court case, and you'll have people on the stand saying, this is the person that I saw do this. This is definitely has to be this person. And we have this belief by the police and by people in general that witnesses tend to be correct. And we know it can be very influential in the courtroom. When somebody says, I saw this person with my eyes, I wouldn't always remember them because of this thing that happened. That's easy for us to understand. You don't have to have a background in science or higher education or anything like that. That's something most of us can understand, that when you see somebody, you recognize somebody. So we know it can be very, very influential. And there's even some studies that actually eyewitness testimony can be more influential than even a confession, because oftentimes there's benefits for somebody to confess. So it's really, really important that we look at eyewitness testimony, and especially because we know that eyewitnesses can be mistaken. And this is where psychology really comes in, is looking at how often are people wrong? What causes people to be wrong? Very few people, get in their head that I'm going to mess up this investigation. I'm going to cause chaos with this. In fact, a lot of people want to be helpful when a crime has happened, and they want to help with an investigation. But by wanting to be helpful, oftentimes they can cause more problems. So we're going to look a little bit at some of that. Now, before I can go too much further into eyewitness testimony, we need to take a little bit of a detour and talk about memory and how we sometimes talk about it in psychology. So this is just one model for how we think about memory, but we're going to need this one in the next few slides then. So this is the 3-stage model of memory. And so the first one is acquisition. And so this is when you or a witness have your perception of the time at the event, so that you're in the park and somebody gets their wallet stolen. So you're there, you're facing in the right direction, you have seen the event happen. So at this point, you need to save it. So I like to sometimes think about these things in kind of a computer analogy, just because it's a little bit easier. So the acquisition is basically you opening a Word file and starting to type into it. The next stage is the storage, and this is when your witness or you are storing the information in order to prevent you from forgetting. So this is you clicking save and putting some sort of name and putting it in your computer somewhere. And then you have the retrieval stage. And this is really the one that the police and investigation is most interested in, because this is the only stage that they have any impact on. The acquisition and storage happens before somebody gets to them, before the witness gets to them. They can't influence who sees the event or how they save that in their memory. But what they can do is the retrieval. And this is when the information is needed. So during the investigation, during the court, that witness needs to pull that memory up and be able to tell somebody else what is from their memory and what happened. And so this is, you going on your computer, trying to find that Word file to bring it up. Now, just like a computer where things can go wrong, we know things can go wrong with your memory as well. And there can be errors at all 3 of these points. So, computer-wise, that could be you didn't even click save at the beginning. You weren't even on the right program. Something goes wrong in the storage, something gets corrupted. You can't open the file in the retrieval. Something can go wrong in all of these. And that can also happen with your memory. Now, depending on the different stages, there can be lots of different things that impact your memory and why you can or can't remember information. So you have things like event characteristics. So how long has it been since the event happened? We know that the closer you're trying to retrieve something to the event that happened, the more likely that's to be helpful, and that you're going to remember more. You haven't had new memories to overwrite that, to take that sort of space, to be similar and shift what you remember. This can be why some cold cases can be very hard to solve is, again, how can you remember one day, 20 years ago in your life? Even if something really traumatic happened, how much do you remember from that time? Frequency, again, something that you do quite a bit. It can be really hard to separate out that specific day. So if something happens on your morning commute, and that's commute you take every single day, it can be really hard to remember what people were there, what train, and those sorts of things were that day versus, the day after, the Monday after, all these other times, and they can really conflict with things. The duration of the thing to be remembered. A phone being taken out of somebody's pocket can happen in the blink of an eye. There's not that much to be able to remember. A prolonged crime or a prolonged traumatic event is longer, but that gives you more to be able to remember and to think about and to keep in your head. Simple things like illumination. Was there enough light for you to even see somebody's face to think that you're able to identify somebody? Or is that just unlikely from, the scene that this is happening in? There's some interesting things with testimony, including weapons and weapon focus. So you would think if somebody is mugging you, that you would be able to remember the face of the person. But we know that if they have a thing like a knife or a gun, most likely you're going to remember the knife and the gun and only a vague shadow of who was holding it. And this is because that's where your attention is focused. It's an unusual thing. It's not just even the threat to life. What we actually know is it's not just a weapons focus, it's an unusual object focus. You can get the exact same results, and somebody they've done the study, is to go into a grocery store brandishing a pink feather duster. Because it's so unusual. People remember the pink feather duster and the actions, but they won't necessarily remember the person. So it's this unusual object, and that's where your focus is rather than on the person. We also know there's things like flashbulb memories, where a very specific event or time makes things really clear in your head, but we've got conflicting evidence in psychology over how useful those flashbulb memories are and how accurate they are. So I have quite clear memories of, where I was in school when the events of 9/11 happened, when we were finding out information. And I pull that up every year when I talk about eyewitness testimony and memories, and I have no idea how accurate that is, or if that's just the story I've been telling myself because it's come out so many times. We also then have the witness characteristics. The person who is trying to remember this, we know that they're statistically more likely things to improve their memory, that they're going to have better memory, and lower things that mean that their memory isn't as accurate. So this can be things like just individual personality factors. Some people just don't pay attention to the minute details, and other people are very, very detail focused. Mood and emotion at the time can have a really big impact. We know that actually there's a sweet spot for stress. If you aren't stressed at all, you're not likely to remember things. So just, an average workday or those sorts of things, you probably, there's nothing that's going to stand out. But if you're too stressed, it can also impact your memory, and you can block things and you're not able to remember. And unfortunately, crime is quite stressful. So that can be very, very tricky with that. But witnesses who might just be enjoying a day out in the park might not have enough stress levels to even remember anything. So mood and emotion and stress levels can really have an impact. Things like drug and alcohol. Is somebody in their right mind to be able to, even have a memory of what happened, and how accurate is that? There's a sweet spot for age as well with witness memories. Children, their memory tends not to be as good. They don't understand things. They're not able to explain things. And so we actually see this rise up until about between about 20 to 40, up to about 60, where memory seems to be quite good. And then about 60, we start to see the memory start to drop off again as old age, mental health issues and stuff like that start to come in. Gender can also be a factor, things like stereotypes. So your expectations and your beliefs in certain things. The closer a crime is to the way it is portrayed in the media can actually conflict with your own memory. We also know that confidence is something that can influence juries, but it actually has no impact on how much somebody remembers. Perpetrator variables, this could be things like disguise, weapons, what they had people do, how they approach the crime scene. And then we have number 4, which is interrogational variables. And this is the post-event information. So what information has become available after this crime has happened that can influence the eyewitness and their memory. And this unfortunately can have a really big impact. And this is really the only thing that the courts and the investigators can really have an influence on. So we're going to talk a little bit about eyewitness confidence. So we know that confidence by juries can be seen as the witness being so strong in their beliefs that this has to be the case and that they're more believable. And we know that this can really sway the juries, but actually when we start to look at the statistics and the studies of this, we're not really sure that there's actually any good link between confidence and accuracy. And actually there's not much of one. And when you start to look at places like the Innocence Project and other places, we can find that about 3/4 of the miscarriages of justice in the United States that we're aware of are based upon extremely confident but mistaken eyewitnesses. So there's really big impacts of getting this wrong. These are people's lives being taken away and danger to the community of not getting the right person. So to kind of put a face to a name, a face to this problem, let me present the case of Ronald Cotton. So in July of 1984, an assailant broke into Jennifer Thompson Canino's apartment and sexually assaulted her. She was then a 22-year-old college student and made every effort to study her perpetrator. She knew that she was going to survive this and that she wanted to make sure she could convict the person who did this to her. As she was working with the investigators, she chose Ronald Cotton as her attacker in a photo lineup. Soon after, she then chose him again in a live lineup, and at this point in time, she said she was 100% sure she had the right man. The evidence at the trial wasn't just her identification. It also included a flashlight found in Cotton's home that resembled the one used by the assailant, rubber from Cotton's shoe that was consistent with the rubber found at one of the crime scenes. But the big deciding factor for the jury and for the case was Thompson Canino's identification of the face of the person who attacked her. He was then sentenced to life imprisonment and spent about 11 years in prison, saying the whole time that he was innocent, and actually got people to listen. They ran the DNA finally and found out, no, it wasn't Ronald Cotton. It was another man named Bobby Poole. And it proved conclusively that Cotton couldn't have been the man who raped Jennifer. Now, the reason that this story is pretty well known and it comes up is not just that we were, that the evidence was wrong, that the eyewitnesses were wrong. Thompson Canino worked really, really hard to say that that she remembered the face, but she reached out to Ronald Cotton after this DNA evidence and after he was released from prison and wrote a letter of apology saying, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. I was part of the reason that you've lost these many years of your life. I thought I was certain and I clearly wasn't. And Ronald Cotton is a very unique man in that he forgave her and they actually ended up becoming friends and got to know each other. And they now actually tour around and give talks. They've done TED Talks. You can find them on YouTube. They've also gone and campaigned to change rules about eyewitness testimony and how that's interpreted and, what happens with those cases to try to stop this from happening from other people. What we find is that witnesses, if they get encouragement, that it can increase their confidence, which then can sway the juries. There can also be mistakes along in the identification process that can confuse recognition and recall. So there's a lot of different things that can go wrong. If this is an area you guys are interested in, I do have another lecture that I can give on this. So again, let Paula know and have her invite me back for the eyewitness and memory and identification one. But as far as new areas in forensic psychology, we're still moving forward and we've been able to get some things changed in how interviews are conducted, how eyewitness lineups and stuff are conducted. So we are improving these and different information to give to juries about how to interpret eyewitness testimony. And the more that people understand that eyewitnesses can be mistaken just because of the way that life and the investigation happens is really helpful. I think the more people that are a little bit skeptical, I think if you have a case that's mostly just eyewitness testimony, with somebody that they're not familiar with, it really shouldn't be enough to convict anybody, because there's just too many times that this has been wrong. So getting to the final bit of this then, what is a forensic psychologist and how does one become one, especially in the UK? Forensic and legal psychology is really growing and there's no limit in sight. I do think that this is an area that is going to continue to be important. It's going to continue to grow and evolve. And it's got so many areas that it touches on that you don't have to like every area. There's going to be an area that you're interested in. And I think that's important, is finding one that fits with, you know, how you view the world and how you want to improve the world. These are just some other areas that both legal and criminological and forensic psychology. I'm, like I said, a very broad definition, so I kind of put these all under forensic psychology. Other people break these down a little bit more, but other areas that we look into. Now, I am somebody who did a PhD in forensic psychology, so I study forensic psychology, and in certain places I can say I'm a forensic psychologist, but over in the UK, somebody who is a chartered and registered with certain organizations forensic psychologist is actually a different approach. That tends to be a Friends D or a taught program, where it's a lot more about interventions, about working in prisons and treatments and stuff like that, versus mine's more research-based. It's a research degree. I did a big research project working with statistics and numbers and stuff like that. There can be a lot of crossover, and actually I've got friends that have done both, and they've gone back and forth between them. But there are certain instances where I can't say I'm a forensic psychologist because I'm not chartered in that way. But for me, I wasn't that interested in treating people. I wanted more about why do people do this and how do I help with the investigation. So for me, that was a better area. And so those are some of the things that you need to think about if you're interested in this area, is what do you want to focus on? And thankfully, along the way, there'll be chances for you to find out more before you have to try to make those decisions. So what do forensic psychologists do? So this is a lot more of the chartered forensic psychologists then. So they do things like piloting and implementing treatment programs. So this can be in prison, this can be out in the community and other places. They might be the ones who try to modify offender behavior, doing treatments and therapies and interventions. So, you know, sex offender programs, trying to get them, you know, before they get released, how do you get them to manage that? Supporting prison staff is another area that they do, providing hard research evidence to support practice. So again, you can't just have people out there trying to fix people, trying to help things. It needs to be based in science, and it needs to be based in research. And so somebody needs to be doing that research. So that's a little bit more where I fit in. Conducting statistical analysis for prison profiling. So that can be something that forensic psychologists do. Giving evidence in court as the expert witness. This is something that in the United States we tend to recognize more with forensic psychology. Advising parole boards and mental health tribunals. I think this is one of the most important things that they're doing, is, you know, what happens if we release this person? What sort of, you know, limitations should we have on their probation? How likely is this person to reoffend? Was it a one-time thing? With certain interventions, would they not offend again? What do we know about this person before we release them? In certain countries, this is a lot more important. So some of the Nordic countries don't have a life sentence. They have 20 years and then they have to release them. So some really famous criminals. So there was the terrorist Andrew Breivik, who killed a lot of people at a summer camp. He's going to have to be released at some point in time because that's how their laws work. So what do you do in those cases? In the United States and the United Kingdom, people can sometimes be put away for forever. So it's not necessarily always the same sort of concern. You also have crime analysis is something that forensic psychologists do. And this is something that I can do as well. Looking at, you know, how likely are certain crimes to happen, what characteristics go along with that, with the offenders and stuff like that. What can we learn from the crimes that we already know about? As far as where people work, again, people tend to only think about prisons or certain other aspects. The largest employer is Her Majesty's Prison Service here in the United Kingdom. But you'll also have forensic psychologists working for the police service, for health services, social services, university departments. We literally just hired another forensic psychologist this last year, so he's working with me now as well. Private consultants. Ministry of Justice is a surprising one, but again, helping, I actually know one of my friends just hired a psychologist, not forensics, but psychologists looking at education and stuff. So they do work their way into government positions. The Home Office. Data collection and analysis. This is really, really important. Having people who understand the data, how people work, how to collect the data, how the questions or how the data is actually achieved is really, really important, and forensic psychologists can have an influence on that. Border agencies, again, this can be some of the investigative psychology, understanding how people work, the social pressures, the world events, those sorts of things. And one of the areas I think people overlook is charities. And this is a great place that really needs more forensic psychologists, because it's not always just working with the police and the offenders. You can work with the offenders when they're released back into the public. You can work with victims, people who might be about to have crimes committed against them, people who are vulnerable. So charities are a very, very important area of work as well. So in the United Kingdom, this is mostly United Kingdom I'm going to be talking about here, but in a lot of places they'll be quite similar. So how do you become a forensic psychologist? So here it's three general things: is an academic background, specialized training, and supervised practice. So in the UK, you would have an undergraduate degree in psychology, or you convert whatever degree that you had into a psychology undergraduate. So in the UK, it's a 3-year undergraduate program for psychology, or if you've already completed a similar type degree, you can do a conversion course for 1 year. Specialized training is then an accredited master's program for 1 year. So the master's program that we currently have at Wolverhampton isn't accredited, but we're looking to add that to it. So there's different regulations with that. And then you have supervised practice, and this is considered stage 2. So stage 1 is specialized training. That's that MSc master's at an accredited program. And that's the supervised practice, that you're out in one of these forensic settings, that you're having hands-on experience, you gain experience from people there. And then once you've completed all that and a degree with that, you can get that chartered forensic psychologist status. So if you're interested in the United Kingdom, I recommend looking at the BPS, which is our British Psychological Society website. They have more information about the processes, because it's quite similar for other chartered specialisms. So things like counseling psychology, occupational psychology, and stuff like that. They have these stages 1 and 2 as well. And you can specifically look at the BPS website for the Division of Forensic Psychology. Now, in other countries, I would recommend looking and finding what your National Psychology Association is, and they should have more information. So in America, that's going to be the APA, the American Psychological Association. But those are the places where you could start to see, what do they say that the pathway is. Now, just some caveats. So a lot of people, I've talked about how broad the area of forensic psychology is, but there are like the nice, shiny, sparkly media areas that everybody thinks that they're going to go into. And these are not the same. So again, somebody who gets a degree in forensic psychology is not going to be collecting physical evidence. That is a forensic science degree. If you are interested in that, the University of Wolverhampton does offer that degree. I've given them basically this lecture a couple weeks ago. So that is out there, but that is a very different focus. You're not going to be the mentalist. You're not going to be a hypnotist, a clairvoyant. You're not going to walk into a room and suddenly know who's committed a crime. We can statistically start to decide who's most likely to have committed the crime. But again, it's still only a prediction, a guess. And it's not going to be, you walk in and just intuitively know this. That is something that's been created by the media. Probably statistically the most likely that you could do out of these 3 unlikely things with a forensic psychology degree is be an international spy. A lot of your national agencies have an interest in people with degrees. Understanding how people work in rough situations is a good background. So places like the CIA in the United States, or MI5 or 6, I always mess up the numbers here in the UK, they might be looking, but honestly, you're better off trying to get in with language skills and stuff like that. So if that's an area you're interested in, look at what they're actually asking for, because it's not always going to be a clear, direct path with that. So if this is an area that you're interested in, what next steps can you take? So University of Wolverhampton, obviously, I have to support them. We do offer an undergraduate degree, the BSc honor psychology, and we actually have a criminal behavior specific route, and this incorporates a little bit more forensic psychology and options in the degree, and we've actually increased how much forensic focus that has from starting from the first year rather than partway through the second year to the end, when we think it fits better with some of the theories and stuff like that. We also offer an MSc in forensic and investigative psychology. We do take people not from a psychology background, but we need it kind of similar and to have achieved well in your undergraduate degree. And you're probably going to have to work a little bit harder if it's a non-psychology background, just because there's going to be some stuff that you're missing, but that's where the other cohort is really, really helpful for you. You could apply for a PhD as well and focus on that. We've got people who come from different backgrounds, but because their focus then starts to be forensic psychology, they can get it that way. One of the best ways that you can start being involved in forensic psychology is volunteering in forensic type settings and getting exposed to that. Oftentimes at those higher levels for forensic psychology, for getting that chartered position, you need to have some experience. So that's really good to see, is this what I want to spend the rest of my life doing, and get some hands-on experience. Highly recommend, if you have access through your local library, a university library or somewhere like that, read peer-reviewed journal articles, not just popular media ones that are easy to read, but look at the scientific method, make sure that they're following good methods, how they talk about it, and understanding what's actually happening out there. And if there's anything I could bring for you with this, is to be skeptical when somebody says it's an open shut case, when they talk about something that sounds too good to be true. Have a little bit of skepticism. Think about, scientifically, is that possible? Is that likely? What sort of research and background go to that? I think that's one of the best things that you can take forward with this then. So just a brief summary of what we've covered is what is forensic psychology, some of the history of forensic psychology, why our jobs are important, looking a little bit at that eyewitness testimony and that they aren't very reliable. So again, if you see a case that's mostly just around eyewitness testimony, be skeptical, be pushing for more evidence in those sorts of cases. What is a forensic psychologist and what we are not? And with that, I have thank you to some of my colleagues and past colleagues that have helped me with this slideshow. And if people have questions, we're going to be opening up the questions here. Paula will be reading them to me. So go ahead and put those in the chat. But if you don't want to share something in a public setting or those sorts of things, feel free to reach out to me at my email. I'm always happy to answer questions that way. Or you can follow me on Twitter. I do share more talks like this, information. A lot of it's also just going to be pictures of my cat because it's also my personal Twitter. But thank you all, and I'm looking forward to some questions.
Thank you very much, Chelsea. That was fascinating as usual. Thank you. And also some great careers advice and course advice there. So that's brilliant. Thank you very much. We have a question from Robin, who asks, is biological psychology the same thing as neuropsychology?
Oh, neither of them are my specialty areas, but my understanding is they are different, but there's a lot of overlap with them. Biology is just the body in general, and neuro is going to focus specifically mostly on the brain. So obviously some of the enzymes and things like that will be the same across both areas, but some of it will be focusing, neuro's a lot more about that brain, the synapses, the neurons and stuff like that.
Okay, thank you. We have a second question from Jordan. With regards to the mention of volunteering, what sort of places can you recommend volunteering to gain the best experience for forensic psychology?
So I can't say what's going to be best because it's going to be what's the best fit for you. Just because somebody's going to have a great time at one forensic opportunity, somebody else might be miserable. I know my brother and I both did the same. We did an internship at the Cincinnati Children's Hospital in the United States in their clinical psychology, where they have children who've been through abuse, have support and things like that. I absolutely loved my time there because I really like research and not necessarily interacting with the people as much. And he hated it because he was stuck in a box and doing data and stuff like that. So it wasn't a good fit for him. I've had students who volunteered with the local police who had an amazing time with that because they definitely focus on supporting the police in the investigation. Trailblazers in the UK is one that for 25 and older, I think they put the age limit in. You help offenders just before they're released get things like cell phones, jobs, how do they fill out applications and stuff like that. A lot of my students have gone on to do that, but you have to be somebody who believes that offenders can be rehabilitated and changed. And if you've as a person do not believe people change, that's not going to be a good fit because you're not going to be helpful for them and it's not going to be good for you. People who have the ability and the resilience, places like victim support charities always need people. People get burnt out a lot. That is a really tough one, but it is such an important one. Being there for, survivors of things, being on call lines and stuff like that. If you are a compassionate person, but also resilient, that could be a really, really good fit. we have people who work with children and then they get experience of, children who come from rougher backgrounds or not having access to safe spaces and things that keep them distracted after school. So there's lots of different ways, but I think focusing on and starting to think about what areas you're interested in and your beliefs as well, I think needs to go into that. So that's a really wishy-washy answer to say I'm not certain.
Okay, thank you very much. And then we've got a question from Bones. Is it possible to enter the MSc in forensics with a different undergrad?
Yes, it is. So in the one that we have, so it's going to depend program by program across the UK. Just because it's not accredited, we have a little bit more freedom over who we take. So that's one of the advantages we have with that. Every year, probably about up to a third of our students come from a non-psychology background. We have people from forensic science, criminology. I think we've had computer science. It's a little bit easier if you come from one of the science or social sciences. But we've taken English and other backgrounds. If you've done well with your undergrad, if you haven't done well, if you haven't got a 2-1 or higher, you would probably do better to have an entire psychology undergraduate degree. But we do have postgrad events where we answer questions, or you can contact me, or if you go through the inquiries, it'll come to me anyway, where we can talk about individual assessments and stuff like that. But we do accept students from non-psychology backgrounds. Now, with that, it's the understanding that we do teach research methods, but it's at a little bit of a faster pace. So you're going to have to put in more time and effort on the statistics and research methods, and that you might have to do a little bit more work looking at some of those basic psychology theories and stuff like this. But we also have smaller cohorts, so it's actually quite nice because a lot of them will oftentimes step up, and the friends that you make on the course will be able to help you through and be like, oh yeah, this is a thing that we've talked about before. You definitely need to look into like the social learning theory and stuff like that. We as lecturers will also try to make sure that the lectures are more accessible and pointing out where you might have to do a little bit more reading than some of the other students. But we've had some of the people who've come from these backgrounds who have been the top marks in the degree. So some of them do very well.
Okay, that's lovely. Thank you. And Bones says, can I ask if the MSc Forensics will be accredited eventually? I live in Ireland, by the way, and thank you for an excellent workshop.
Thank you. So we are hoping to try to push for accreditation and run both an accredited and non-accredited at the same time, because we don't want to lose what's quite unique about our program. So yes, we also have, part of having the accredited program is having the right staff members with their right background, because I don't really have the right background and training to be as involved in the accredited version. Now the accredited is really only super important for the people who want to go on to become those chartered forensic psychologists with doing treatments and stuff. A lot of the jobs that are looking for forensic psychology backgrounds, oftentimes, unless it is that specific path, don't really care if it's accredited or not. So what I recommend is looking at the jobs that you're interested in. What are they actually asking for? Is it an accredited BPS master's, or is it just a master's in an understanding in the area? A lot of our students currently go on to do PhDs, work in prisons, the police, continue the jobs that they're at. Some of the ones who come from more of like a law background continue in more of a legal background. We've had students get jobs with the National Crime Agency. So a lot of those sorts of jobs, it doesn't really matter, but you have a better understanding going in. So, but yeah, we're working on that. 2 years at the earliest, possibly 3. And again, it's going to depend, finances, support, getting the paperwork clear and stuff like that as well. But we do have our sights on adding that. So if that's something you're interested in, check back in a year or 2.
Brilliant, thank you. And just a couple of people commenting, a lecture about profiling would be fabulous if possible, Edward says. Martina says she'd like to participate in a workshop about criminal profiling or about interrogation techniques. I don't know whether that one is in your, armory.
I don't know that I could do interrogation. I could look at detecting deception with some of that can cross over a bit. But there's a lot of really questionable things happening with interrogations that I don't always feel as comfortable. And I'm have very strong opinions about, so I don't know that I'd feel as comfortable with that. But yeah, detecting deception kind of crosses over with that, and I could definitely get something together on that because I do lecture on that. Profiling is definitely one that I have, but if you like watching shows like Criminal Minds and those sorts of things, it might ruin certain illusions. It doesn't work that way. But actually, I didn't say, but my background and what I did my PhD in is something called crime linkage, which split apart from profiling about 15 to 20 years ago now. So some of the early papers are shared between the two, and they are quite similar. And linkage can be part of profiling, but we're kind of on our own as well. So I'm kind of in an offshoot with that as well. So that is, I also have a book chapter coming out where I wrote with a couple other crime linkage people about profiling, which is a little bit weird to have us do that. But so yeah, I'm comfortable giving a lecture on profiling.
Sounds fantastic. Definitely will be in touch, Chelsea. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, and good night. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.